If you've used a Saleae Logic Analyzer before, you'll know there's one slightly unusual limitation, and that is that you're not able to use a normal trigger like a typical oscilloscope. Your options are to run a kind of looping, continuous running system where it's untriggered. You can also do a trigger-based system, but where it's a one-shot capture. So if I set it up here for the falling edge of a UART signal and do a capture, it will catch that edge and do a 1 second single shot capture. However, it can be extremely useful when debugging embedded systems to have a continuous running trigger, just like on a standard oscilloscope set to a normal trigger mode. Recently, Saleae have added a number of options for triggering on protocols, this thing called trigger view. So if you go to the analyzers option and select trigger view, you can select an analyzer that you've got enabled, such as UART here, and put in a hexadecimal value that appears in the protocol, and then run a continuous capture. Oops, I forgot to enable the trigger there. Enable the trigger, run a capture, and you'll now see that it's continuously triggering on the UART packet. This solves the problem for a certain subset of cases, but say you want to trigger on, for example, a PWM signal, like what I've got above here, or if I didn't know any of the contents of the packet, or it didn't have any kind of fixed header that I could trigger off, then this is not particularly useful. There is, however, a workaround to this. If you go to Analyzers, add an additional analyzer, and scroll down to Simple Parallel, then if you select as the channel, as channel 0, the signal that you want to trigger off, so in this case I'm going to trigger off the PWM signal, and I'm also going to set that as the clock. So it's got both the clock and the data 0 signal of the parallel bus set to the same signal, which is a digital signal that I want to trigger off. And then I select if I want to trigger on the rising edge or the falling edge, so I'm going to select rising edge. Then I'm going to make sure I untick both the stream to terminal and show protocol results in table, because that will fill up with data extremely quickly if we don't do that. Press save, and now I want to trigger on, because I've set trigger on rising edge, the value will always be 1, so I'm going to type in 1 there, and now I'm going to enable that. Did something wrong there. That's because I didn't select the right one. Select the trigger to be simple parallel, and then let's do that. And now you'll see it's actually running continuously, but it's triggered to my PWM signal, so we're seeing a nice constant trigger like you'd get on a standard oscilloscope. And just to show you that on something else, so if we wanted to set it to be, say, my SPI chip select instead, so I'd select SPI chip select here, SPI chip select, I'm going to do a falling edge for this one, save, and then obviously because it's a falling edge the value will always be 0 that we're triggering off, and press play on that. So now it's triggered, and it's sort of hard to tell, but it is continuously triggering, so we can see because my SPI bus is actually sending constant data, but you can see it's constantly triggering because it's relation to the PWM signal underneath. You can actually set even more complex triggers than this. So say, for example, we only wanted to trigger our SPI bus, we only wanted to trigger our system when the SPI chip select is low, but also this PWM signal is high. We can set that up by going into the edit on the parallel bus, enabling another channel, so in this case PWM, leave all the settings the same, so keep the clock as the SPI chip select. And now we want to trigger when data 0, which is data bit 0 of the parallel bus, which is the chip select, is 0, and when PWM signal is 1, which is the second bit in the data, so that's effectively hexadecimal OX2, 2. So now it will only trigger when the PWM signal is high at the same time as the chip select being low. Initially, until it gets a trigger, you see this free running screen, so I'm just going to set the PWM to be a bit higher duty cycle, so now we can see it. It's now only going to trigger when the chip select is a falling edge and also when the PWM signal is high. So you can actually set quite complex triggers up using this mechanism in a free running kind of normal trigger mode, like on a typical oscilloscope. And that's it.